It's always going to feel hard unless you choose, you're actively deciding that there's a new way of being. For people who are still in the belief system of the version of themselves making the choices on their fears as a child, how on earth would you make different choices today?
And I think for so many of us, we become the story that we tell ourselves about ourselves. There's plenty of tactics in my book. I mean, intermittent fasting and deliberate cold therapy and deliberate heat therapy and light therapy, resistance training and stress plants, and all these things that I talk about in the book are tactics. And tactics are very important because people do want to know what to do. But behind that, or before that, there is a deeper, more profound biopsychosocial intake form.
Jeff Krasno, welcome to Rooted in Wellness.
Great to be here, Rana.
This is long overdue. I wanted to connect with you for so long. I would say since COVID, I found myself going to your page for some solace
Mm,
in a world that seems so dogmatic or, I really went quiet during COVID for fear of asking the wrong thing, saying the wrong thing, and everyone and their mother in the wellness industry also had a protocol at that time. And I found myself going to your page because you've got this beautiful way of merging spirituality into science and also your personal beliefs, which ties in so beautifully into your book.
mm,
Um, I just got back from the ashram. I led a retreat at the ashram,
mm.
and I was able to get 4 days in on the Caribbean Sea. And here I am sitting at the pool with a book called Good Stress. It's
Yeah,
like, you're reading this on vacation?
yeah.
But it was the most perfect book to read on vacation. So I'm so excited to have you here to
Mm.
talk about this. So before we dive in, this podcast is all about ancient wisdom in our modern world and really how you can become more rooted in your health and in yourself, but also this inner wisdom that we all have to heal.
Mhm.
So to start off, what are three practices that you have that help you feel more rooted in your health and happiness?
Yeah, well, I'll go from the most anodyne to the most wacky. How's that?
Yeah.
So I have a morning breathwork practice that is it helps me get outside. So I always do it outside, and it's I guess you would call it a single pointedness of mind practice
Mm-hmm.
where I'll just get very quiet in my body and just sort of observed the natural world around me and let thoughts emerge and feelings emerge and sensations emerge, and then just always witness them non-judgmentally and come back to that single pointed focus of the breath. And you can use other gimmicks, if you will. It doesn't always have to be the breath, although the breath is something that you generally always have
Mhm.
until you don't have it. Then you have another problem. Um, but you can use a mantra or a kasina or drishti, gaze point, always coming back to a single point of focus. And the real opportunity there is in the return
Mhm.
because meditation, these practices should not be confused with turning off the spigot of thoughts. They will arise, but the opportunity is in the return to that focus.
Mhm.
And then that can really spill into the other parts of your life,
Yeah.
off the cushion, if you will. Okay, so then the other protocols I would say is I have a very, very dedicated, non-negotiable contrast bathing morning
Right.
ritual, which
Yeah,
is,
which we'll dive into.
yeah, hot, cold, hot, cold.
This is daily.
This is
Wow.
without negotiation, which makes it difficult to travel. I'm about to go on quite a journey, and part of the fun of the logistics was figuring out where I could do this every day. But I don't also want to be um, trapped by my own
Yes.
protocols.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
anyhow, but when I'm home, it is certainly part of my routine. And often in the sauna, this will get to the more wackier bits, is that, and TMI for your audience is that I'm not clothed,
Mhm.
and I'm often doing air squats naked, dripping sweat, reciting the mantra, which is a Nichiren Buddhist mantra, Nam Myoho Renge Kyo. You
Mhm.
might be familiar with it. So you can imagine me naked, squatting in the sauna, sweating, Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, Nam Myoho. And it's actually not a joke. But you really eventually began to actually embody the vibration of it,
Hmm.
and the world ceases to be symbolic and just becomes the thing.
I knew I would be pleasantly surprised asking you. I asked this question. One, obviously, that's the first. You're the first person to
Mm,
give that answer. But we
okay.
talk about wellness with such rigidity, and we
Mm,
think that we need to follow these insane protocols, which might be good for one person, but not the other. And it's to showcase like the wisdom that you found with your body and the things that make you feel good. And I want to hover on that aspect of coming back, with mantra without judgment.
mm,
Right. So when you're catching your mind shift, I think a lot of people will quit their morning wellness protocol or mindfulness protocol because of the judgment that comes with it. Ah, it's too hard.
mm,
Can't come back to it. I'm not good at meditation, or I'm not good at breath work. When it's like the gap in that non-judgment that we take out into the world. So thank you for sharing that.
yeah.
So, on the flip side, you and I both work with a lot of people who have practices that cause them to be uprooted. And a lot of these protocols, especially living in LA, might feel like it's something that's really, part of a checklist to make them feel good every day, but it's
Mm,
actually uprooting them, maybe causing more stress, worry, or anxiety.
mm,
So I'm always fascinated by people like you who, like me, have had this healing journey. Do you notice when you get uprooted, or do you slowly drift to the point where you feel imbalances again that draw you back? What are the things that cause you to feel uprooted?
That's interesting. Yeah. It's interesting to conflate the uprootedness with one's over dedication to protocol, for example. I mean, there's this notion of orthorexia,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah,
I don't like anything that has the prefix ortho.
exactly. Yeah, I don't want to be
Orthodontics,
part of it.
orthodox fundamentalism, um, or orthorexia. But this overconsumption with our dietary choices or our protocols, such that we become kind of neurotic or fundamentalist about
Mhm.
it, and can't exist without them, or that we don't have the resilience to operate in the world just kind of here and now.
Yeah,
Um, I mean, I think that, many of us would be so fortunate to have that problem, I
yeah,
suppose.
yeah.
But for me, it's been funny going out and talking about this book because it's not something that I've typically done.
Hmm.
Um, and I have a lot of anxiety around public speaking and opening my mouth to say words. Uh,
Shocking.
yeah, people are often surprised by it because I tend not to be awful at it. So I've had to really sturdy myself in many ways to go out and be the reluctant public face of my company or the book or whatever. And that process of learning to trust myself has been a real journey, like a very recent journey, because it can throw me off the horse.
Hmm.
I will, on many occasions, show up for things um, like this, like this conversation, and feel as if my pants are too tight.
Yeah, yeah.
And by that, I mean, by that, I mean, the only time you actually really feel your pants
Yeah.
is when they're too tight.
Exactly.
And by the same token, the only time you actually really feel yourself is when you are too tight. And, um, and we know that kind of as the sympathetic nervous system or some degree of amygdala hijack where, your respiratory heart rate starts to increase and you're just tight in your muscles and you become a
Mm.
little bit more self-obsessed and distrustful of the world around you. Your aperture of attention becomes very narrow. That was a very apt description of me in these situations. And I've had to
Mm.
become sort of comfortable in that discomfort. But that's part of good stress, I suppose.
Yeah, I love that you shared that because I would say that that is my most recent area of growth. Also, when I launched this podcast,
Mm.
I would have to literally look in the mirror and say, "You're not going to die.
Yeah,
Today
right.
is not the day."
Yeah.
Right. And how much
Yeah.
of that I'm curious with you too now, knowing about your story from childhood. is this behavioral conditioning,
Mhm.
right? Because we were never taught that it was okay to be free. Or maybe we had the people in our environment, and you're going to share about your story, where I became such an introvert to the point where one of the most common pieces of feedback that I get from people is my calming, soothing energy and my
Mhm.
voice.
Yeah.
That was my trauma response. I had to go inward and be quiet and be calming because there's so much chaos around me.
Mm.
So I love that you share that because I think a lot of people think when we get to a position, especially with the caliber of businesses that you've grown, that this is effortless, easy work for you to do. But the message behind what you're sharing and to be able to overcome that in order to do so is something that I think a lot of listeners can take away with as inspiration. So
Mm.
that really leads into the concept of stress. When you ask how somebody is today, I'm stressed,
Yeah.
right? We've normalized living with these levels of stress and to the point that it's making us void of connection anymore. I don't know how you are because all I know is that you're stressed and oof, maybe we don't want to talk about that, right?
Mm.
But through the reading of your book, it's not about eliminating stress anymore. I think that's kind of a concept that we're trying to chase that isn't realistic. And when we look at ancient wisdom, it's not something that's practiced or preached either. It's about going through the stress in order to kind of, awaken new levels of living life to its fullest.
Mm.
So let's talk a little bit more about your personal story and your journey into wellness, because, like, the concept wealth and wellness is something that I know everyone's bringing up because it's so accurate.
Yeah.
It does feel that way, right? And, with your lovely wife, who I adore so much, you would think that somebody with your background, you had so much access to wealth and information. But can you take us back to how this all started?
Yeah, sure. Well, as you mentioned, my better three quarters, Skylar, and it is her birthday today, so I'd be remiss not to point that
Yeah.
out. Um, she's I'm really just been kind of the torchbearer for her mostly. I mean, she's the one that sort of introduced me to this whole world of wellness and healing, sort of incongruously tied to 9/11. So I'm a refugee of the music industry. At that juncture in 2001, I was operating a fledgling record label and management company down in lower Manhattan. And then that tragedy occurred.
Mhm.
And we were in that tiny little perimeter around what became Ground Zero, cordoned off for a number of months. And, living in lower Manhattan, or just in Manhattan in general during that time, was quite amazing moment
Yeah.
because
Can't even imagine.
there was a tremendous amount of collective grief.
Yeah.
But that collective grief, not unlike what we just experienced here in Los Angeles in the wake
Mm.
of the fires, elicited really people's better angels and munificence, but also compelled people to do some madcap, crazy things. And one of those people was Skylar, my wife. So she opened a yoga studio at Ground Zero, literally out of the ashes, in the floor above my office. And yeah, for that extended period of time, I got to watch these bedraggled, grief-stricken, beleaguered yogis, traipse up these cockeyed stairs into this really funky, funky studio. I mean, this was prior to the advent of, an Equinox on every
Right.
corner or some, Tony
Mm.
Core Power here and there. This was a one-room studio. The radiator in the corner whistled incessantly. The bathroom was actually in the studio, and it was like the width of a bread box, basically. So you'd have to go, to the bathroom while everyone was practicing. But it had a lot of soul. It was called Kula, which
Yeah.
is transliterated as intentional community. And this is where I first experienced, I guess maybe witnessed from a front row seat, the power of somatic and spiritual practice in combination with community to heal. And, I would watch these sweaty, open-hearted yogis, file out of that little room and collapse on this little stained futon in the vestibule outside, and just share share with each other and kind of piece together their lives again. And that really bent the arc of my both my personal and professional life. It really led me to found Wanderlust, which became a very large series of yoga and wellness events around the world. Um, but kind of along the course of doing that over a decade of wonderful and
Mm,
treacherous
I can relate.
experiences, I got quite ill. And, I was the product of kind of just modernity's circumstances. I was on a plane 150, 200 days a year. I was committing carbicide,
Yeah.
sometimes I call it. I was living kind of coffee to wine o'clock, um, constantly negatively, chronically stressed, with incoming from every angle.
Mm,
And that was really, yeah, where I would say, yeah, my forays into health and wellness took a U-turn into wealth and wellness, because there I was kind of in the wellness industry
yeah.
with all of these anodyne symptoms that we've normalized, but they're really absolutely abnormal. Chronic fatigue, inability to concentrate, uh, insomnia, kind of dad bod, man boobs, little weird protuberances growing in my armpits, like weird shit. And then I got my diabetes diagnosis, and and I had to wake up.
I was shocked to read about your late night binges and drive-throughs,
Yeah.
being surrounded by so many. And, I think that there's a common thread that I hope no one has to experience, but, nothing matters when you don't have your health. And, the fact that you've now lived through 9/11 and growing from those ashes, literally, now these LA fires and growing from this on top of your own healing journey, it's really upsetting that it takes these big circumstances for us to just like, oh, pull back
Yeah.
a little bit instead of drowning in our day to
Yeah.
day, and how hard that we think wellness is when everything that you have talked about today and so often that we do on this podcast, the greatest takeaways from wellness happen to be free.
Yeah.
The stillness in the mornings, the finding our breath, the finding of sangha and community, right? And I love just the resonance of you ultimately like building this ashram. You had a wife that was doing it herself, and then now you're building it into your own life. And I think there's so much beauty in that.
Yeah. It's curious, something that you say there is that why we have to reach this crisis point, this rock bottom,
Yeah.
in
Why?
order to wake up. And when the nature of these diseases that we're dealing with at an epidemic level are so progressive and insidious, they're not just like a fall off the precipice.
Hmm.
It's like, I think there's a Hemingway quote, about going bankrupt. It happens very, very slowly and then
Mm.
suddenly.
And then suddenly,
Yeah.
yeah.
And that's the same deal with heart disease, chronic disease of all sorts, diabetes, stroke, Alzheimer's, etc. So, yeah, and for me, it was hard for me to grok that I was part of this bigger nightmare,
Mhm.
given all of the arrows in my quiver. But there I was, 50 years old with a total hip replacement, with 210 pounds, diabetes, which essentially just makes me average, which
Right.
is which
Oh,
is the sad component.
essentially what makes you average in today's world. That's
Mhm.
exactly it.
Yeah.
So let's talk about that then, this chronic imbalance, chronic dis-ease that leads to disease today.
Mhm.
And a lot of the symptoms that you've mentioned, again, it's something else that we've normalized, right? Whether it's the stress, the overworking, the gaining of weight, the brain fog. I call it carbitarian.
Yeah.
Also, carbitarian
Yeah.
diets, or these symptoms that we're experiencing, but we're not attributing them to the suffering of our body,
Yeah.
right? So you talk
Well,
about this in your book.
yeah, I mean, I think we're living at this strange moment where we've engineered our life for convenience, and comfort at every turn. So that has created a situation where we have kind of endless availability to this self-stable, nutrient deficient
Mhm.
calories, right? Just kind of in the palm of our hand
Access.
at DoorDash, just like Arby's, Chick-fil-A, whatever, Wendy's, McDonald's, Burger King, whatever.
Yeah.
Sometimes I was wondering, I was driving over here, there's so many of these places.
Every corner.
Like, how do they get wound up? Like, Bob, I've got a line on chickens.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
let's fillet them. Okay, Chick-fil-A. I mean, how did all these things get wound up? Anyways, I don't really know. But I think this elixir, this combination between always available cheap calories and emotional dysregulation is so caustic.
Mhm.
So we live within this attention economy, let's say, where everyone and everything is vying for our conscious attention moment to moment. And they're essentially leveraging our own human negativity bias to capture that
Yeah.
attention,
Right.
commodify our own focus to sell it. And the product of that is feeling a sense of not enoughness, of deficiency, of and living within comparison all the time.
Mm.
And so, and then just over there in the pantry, there are engineered foods to hit your bliss point, that magical combination of fat and salt and sweet to give you that spritz of ephemeral dopamine
Yeah.
to satisfy those feelings of perceived deficiencies and discontents. And they're so easy. And oh boy, you just grab for those chips and you grab for those cookies because they're right there and they just are going to make you feel better,
Yeah.
but only for a very, very short period of time. And then, of course, the long-term impacts of that are so maladaptive. So we live in this moment where, for we've created a surfeit of calories and then we've created a lot of emotional dysregulation, and those things together really create an expected and normal result, which is a 44%
Mhm.
obesity rate.
Right.
Yeah.
What a great perspective too, right? Because now more than ever before in history, we have access to so much discomfort in the world, whether it's through media, news, politics, our environment. Look at the mental health crisis that's happening here in Los Angeles, right? Like
Hmm.
it's at every layer, and we're experiencing it firsthand. And it's kind of like oscillating between the scarcity and the fear to the dopamine and the hit of something that makes us good on the next
Hmm.
slide over, the
Yeah.
next swipe.
Mhm.
So, despite people's best efforts and the knowing of the rise of disease and the constant drug commercials and commercials for prescription drugs, you're feeling down on yourself. You're driving by, let's call it Chick fil A or wherever you hear that
Mm.
or smell that wafting, God knows what's in the oil that they fry everything in,
Right. And it
right?
puts you under a spell and you just
You're under
drift
a
in.
spell.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you have to have it all. And it gives you bliss just for a moment only to have fueled inflammation within your body.
Yeah.
So,
Well, that's sort of the metaphor that you could pull on, which is that, that short-term comfort leads to long-term discomfort.
yeah.
But the other way around is true too. That short-term discomfort can actually lead to the long-term real ease
Mhm.
that
Right.
we're looking for.
Yeah, good
Yeah.
point. In your book, you share also about like you didn't just arrive at 50 becoming pre-diabetic, right?
Yeah.
It was the culmination, or, in our Ayurvedic terms, we call it accumulation.
Right.
The accumulation of all these things. So if you're trying to pinpoint or this hardcore mentality, well, I'm just going to cut this out. I'm going to do this hardcore in order to heal again. It's not even about that. Like we've got to go back all the way to childhood to kind of clean up the
Yeah.
pipes of what's been going on.
Yeah, I think this is really the great lesson that I wish to communicate to most people, because there's plenty of tactics out there. There's plenty of tactics in my book. I mean,
Mhm.
intermittent fasting and deliberate cold therapy and deliberate heat therapy and light therapy, resistance training and stress plants and all these things that I talk about in the book are tactics. And tactics are very important because people do want to know what to do.
Mhm.
But behind that, or before that, there is a deeper, more profound biopsychosocial intake form that
Yeah.
one must conduct on oneself. And I think for so many of us, we become the story that we tell ourselves about ourselves. And I'll raise my hand, guilty as charged. So I grew up
Absolutely.
a chubby kid moving around from country to country, always trying to fit in, essentially willing to sacrifice every and any authentic aspect of myself for a sense of belonging. And that was a rucksack that I pulled into adulthood, this feeling that I would always people please. I was just a consummate pleaser, perpetual pleaser, but at the same time, I'd never be quite good enough. And I'd always be that chubby kid whose fate was written in his genetic stars, and that change was simply not possible for me.
Mhm.
And I believe that that is resonant for a lot of people, that you become that story. But as I began to delve into Eastern mysticism and into human physiology, I learned a great lesson. And this is a lesson, of course, that the Buddha had under the Bodhi tree 2,500 years ago without the luxury of an electron microscope or knowing what germ theory was or anything like that. This notion that we are impermanent, that the universe is impermanent, subject to construction and deconstruction at all times. So clinging to anything or craving anything is totally futile because all we are is transient. We're constantly in flux. Now, this is a great spiritual lesson that was echoed in other traditions as well. But when you open the hood on the human organism, what you learn is something quite similar, is that the physical actually patterns the metaphysical, that we are these 7 octillion atoms, 70 trillion cells, experiencing 37 billion chemical reactions per second. In the last minute, I've lost 40,000 skin cells.
Right.
We have 39 trillion prokaryotes in our guts, on our skin, and our various organs, these single-celled bacteria that are turning over every 4 minutes to 24 hours. Literally, Mona and Jeff are not the same people that started this podcast. And there is a great lesson in that, that
Mhm.
change is not only possible, it's all that's on offer
Yeah.
for people.
Yeah.
And to really truly embrace that possibility of change, that is probably the deepest work that you can do, to retell that story about yourself and know that, yes, change is not only available, that's all there is. And so, moment to moment, I can make decisions about protocols that I'm going to adopt, tactics, the environment that I want to shape, to essentially make sure that that change is operating on a trajectory on the spectrum towards healing, towards wholeness, and away from disconnection and disease. And if there's any message that I want to impart, it's that change is there waiting for you.
Oh God, I love this so much. I can feel my heart like beating faster because you're talking
Nice.
my language. And the frustrating thing about this is when we talk about this wisdom, like this insane intelligence of the body.
Mm,
Um, there's a lot of people in our world who say, "Well, there's no clickbait to that, right? It's ancient wisdom. There's no clickbait." But it's this fundamental understanding of if you want to drive change, getting to know how you want to feel again. Because as you said, and thank you for sharing your story, even when I do my initial calls with new clients, the first thing, Mona, just tell me how to eat. What's the supplement protocol? How am I working out? All right, let's do this, right? And 9 times out of 10, we are talking about their childhood. And I'm often met by tears.
mhm.
And for people who are still in the belief system of the version of themselves making the choices on their fears as a child, how on earth would you make different choices today? It's always going to feel hard unless you choose, you're actively deciding that there's a new way of being,
Mhm.
right? And I think that that story and your story also is just so powerful in understanding that. So thank you for sharing the
Yeah.
picture of change.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think this is where mysticism and medicine share a bridge, you know. Um, and it really violates our sense of self identity
Mm,
because we feel day to day that there is a stable, reliable Mona or a
mhm,
stable, reliable Jeff. This is often underwritten by kind of a sense of physical continuity or even psychological continuity. I wake up in the morning, I take off my shirt, I get in front of the mirror, I look, oh, there's Jeff. He's essentially appears more or less as he did yesterday and the day
mm,
before. And he has more or less the same beliefs that he did yesterday and the day before. So we're essentially fooled into this illusion of self.
mhm,
Um, often also underwritten by that tightness that we were talking about earlier, that I'm
Mm.
here, I'm separate.
Yeah.
And But of course, all you need to do is pick up a family photo album and open the pages, and there's Mona as like this
Yeah.
angelic, cherubic little baby, and then as this like hot teenager or whatever, and this distinguished woman as she is now. And to know that, of course, impermanence is all there is.
Absolutely.
And then the other piece of that equation is that if we are impermanent and changing all the time, what is the mitigator of that change?
Mm.
Well, we're always changing in relationship to our environment.
Right.
And
Right.
this was, of course, the other great central tenet of Buddhism, this notion of interdependence. That, well, of course, the Buddha had the wonderful image of Indra's net, right? That the
Yeah.
entire universe exists as a massive cobweb, and at every juncture of that cobweb is a crystalline diamond reflecting every other juncture. I mean, it's just a absolutely
Beautiful.
sublime
Yeah.
image, but that gave birth to this notion of, I think it's pratitya samutpada, but it's like dependent origination. Everything is dependent upon everything else.
Hmm.
And if you bring that back to the human body, that what you learn quite quickly is that you cannot separate the function and behavior of your organism from the function and behavior of its environment. They are actually one thing.
Yeah.
They are an environism or an
Whenever it
organment
is.
or something, one or the other, that you can't pull them apart. And again, that does also violate our sense of self, because we often associate ourselves with a locus of consciousness kind of
Mm.
crouching behind the eyes somewhere, in this ever sagging bag of skin that we sort of have that
Mm.
breaks down from time to time, and we'll take it in to get fixed like the car.
Yeah.
Um, but that this locus of consciousness is separate from everything else in the foreground and background of our attention. But of course, any even remotely rigorous study of ecology. I mean, we don't make our own oxygen, right?
Yeah.
So we're not
Exactly.
we're
Yeah.
not autotrophs or heterotrophs. We're reliant always on the world around us. But even in our relationships that seem to impact how our genes
Mm.
express,
Oh,
and
yeah.
our food that expresses that changes the expression of our genes. So it's this interdependent net is everywhere.
I love that. I'm so turned on by this concept of quantum healing. I'm studying it right now.
Mm,
And even you and I right now, I cannot wait for the day until we can actively see kind of our shared energy and
yeah.
biome that were created on our own, but outside in the world. And I know probably like most of the people listening, you've had a moment in your life where you're in a different environment or the stage is set. And when the stage is set for you to feel your best, maybe to relax a little bit more, maybe the food's a little healthier, you're practicing your yoga, all of a sudden your physiology changes despite the rigidity behind it. So I think it's so important to try to kind of own in on the choices behind that. So I want to go back, when we talked about chronic imbalances, you mentioned
Mhm.
so many in your book, so many that you were experiencing. What are some things that listeners should really kind of like, okay, we've talked about this one vessel that we've got and it's sending me signals all the time. I've never really been taught how to listen to it. What do they need to be looking out for in order to not go down the same path as you?
Yeah. Well, I think you point to this notion of imbalance wisely, because really imbalance is the signature of disease, if you will.
Yeah.
Um, and to the degree that we can refine that sort of interoception to recognize it, to see and hear the signals of it. So it appears in a whole variety of different ways. So you could have blood sugar imbalances, right? So if you have a blood sugar imbalance, that will likely lead eventually to insulin resistance. Your cells will stop making energy as efficiently. They'll store glucose and other well, fat as fat.
Mhm.
Um, so then you will experience degrees of brain fog and lack of energy. And those are, very, very common symptoms. And of course, I think there's some outrageous number, like 93% of Americans are metabolically dysfunctional,
Yeah.
right? So,
Yeah.
so there's blood sugar imbalances. There's neurotransmitter imbalances, for example. So we have excitatory neurotransmitters and inhibitory neurotransmitters, like glutamate on one side and GABA on the other side. You know, too much GABA, right? You're going to start to feel sort of like maybe numb and disassociative. Too much glutamate, too much excitatory activity, you're going to start to feel what is known as ADHD or something. So
ADHD.
overactive. So this is again a place where, health is really about the body's ability to foster dynamic homeostasis, really. I call it the place on the teeter-totter where no one's feet is touching the ground, right? And because it's not a stable place, we're never perfectly in balance.
Yeah.
We kind of find it and flirt with it and glimpse it. But the amazing thing is, like, the body is very engineered for homeostasis. This is why we shiver or sweat when we get, very cold or very hot. The body is remarkable at
Mhm.
maintaining a pH balance, right? You really, really have to knock your body off its
Yeah.
course to become too alkaline or too acidic. You can actually hold your breath. We won't do that right at
Not
this
today.
moment, but that hypercapnia, that concentration of carbon dioxide will make you slightly more alkaline.
Mhm.
But that's actually adaptive, because when you have a little bit more alkalinity in your body, there is less affinity between oxygen and hemoglobin. So, I mean, this is the amazing thing. So, and I know I'm taking a little bit off
No,
course here, but
not at all.
things like holding your breath, for example, inducing a mild state of hypoxia, like stress in the right dose,
Mhm.
is so adaptive, because what I just described. So, let's say you hold your breath for a little while, your oxygen concentration goes down a tiny bit, your carbon dioxide concentration goes up a little bit. So mild hypoxia, mild hypercapnia kind of have these chemoreceptors around here in your carotid arteries. They're going to sense that phenomenon, and they're going to springboard your body into this production of additional red blood cells, because the red blood cells are the couriers for
Mhm.
oxygen, the hemoglobin in them, the couriers to your cells and your mitochondria for energy production. So your body knows when it has a little bit of stress, and it immediately adapts. And this is why, of course, Olympian athletes
Yeah.
often train at high altitudes, because the air is less dense and the
Yes.
partial pressure of oxygen is lower. So the oxygen diffusion is lower. So they're going to create more red blood cells. They're going to also just create greater efficiency at the mitochondrial level. So that is a great example of the body's adaptive response to stress. And when you start to actually unpack the body, it is riddled with
Yeah.
these adaptive mechanisms. Just it's
Look under the hood.
everywhere to be found. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So when people are ignoring this kind of chronic stress every day, long term, then, you know, leading to disease, would you say that stress is the instigator of all disease?
I think it's stress in the wrong doses, for sure. I
Yeah.
mean, stress the way we consume it now in a modern context, when it's chronic and in the wrong dosage,
Hmm.
um, can lead to a panoply of disease. I mean, certainly there's the most obvious ones associated with kind of hormone dysregulation or hormone imbalance.
Yeah.
So you start to have too many stress hormones and not enough, like melatonin, for example. So what's going to happen in that particular case, when you're constantly have this sort of IV drip of cortisol, you're going to
Hmm.
undermine immune function. You're going to stop producing monocytes and neutrophils and cells associated with the innate immune system. It's going to begin to erode the balance of bacteria in your gut, going to lead to this condition of dysbiosis,
Hmm.
or potentially leaky gut, intestinal permeability. It's going to um, dysregulate blood sugar. And again, that is a really great example of the body is actually programming. It's actually just doing what it's programmed to do.
Absolutely.
So you have a stressful incident, or s- some sort of perceived threat. Your body then reacts to produce cortisol. Cortisol is going to then signal the liver to actually release additional glucose, because you want that glucose to go to your extremities so you can fight or fly. You want that in short little bursts, but when it never ever goes
You
away,
got it.
then you've got a problem. But you have to remember that the body is just doing what it's supposed to do. And in this way, chronic diseases are s- are in many ways could be considered the normal expected byproducts of the body just doing what it is programmed to do.
Exactly.
Mm.
And digestive symptoms are no different. You don't just wake up with leaky gut one day.
Mhm.
It's the accumulation of stressors over time, right? And it's the same with autoimmune. It's the same with cancer. The body's functioning at its best to heal in those moments due to the stressor. It's doing its job, but it's
Mhm.
almost like a retraining that needs to happen in order for your body to come back on track to heal.
Yeah. And but then again, when you begin to untangle the origins of the stress response in the body, you actually find that it's generally very adaptive.
Yeah, yeah,
So, calorie paucity, for
right.
example, you know, we evolved to have some scarcity,
Hmm.
and it would be totally normal and adaptive for Mona's loincloth to get a little tight in the in the
Yeah,
late summer, early fall, because that fat accumulation was really just warehoused energy for a winter that was around the corner, right? And then during that winter, there would be more of a paucity of calories, and that would keep you lean. But now we're learning that it does a bunch of other things too. It stimulates this process
yeah.
of autophagy and ketosis and metabolic flexibility and stimulates the sirtuin pathways and all that kind of
Hmm.
stuff. But now we essentially live from a calorie perspective in a world where winter never comes.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
the body, again, is just doing what it is supposed to do, store fat
Mhm.
for a rainy day, but then it never rains.
It never rains. Absolutely. In your book, you also talk about invisible stressors. Um, I would say mindset probably ties into that, but some stressors are so normalized today that we don't even recognize them as being harmful.
Mm.
So, what are some of the hidden stressors that you address?
Mm. I can't remember.
Yeah. No.
No, I think that the stress that we can't put our thumb on
Yeah.
is the day in and day out stress. I mean, for me, I often associate this kind of stress with being a product of what one might call the persuasion economy,
Hmm.
where our focus and attention is being so vied for that we actually we're not even totally aware of how it is being leveraged. And most of the time, the incentives on social media, for example, are so perverse
Mm.
that it's the loudest, most salacious, most hyperbolistic voices that get, the most airtime. And it's those voices that keep us in a constant state of fear and outrage.
Yeah. Yeah.
And oftentimes we don't even know it.
Hmm.
And so, we end up just kind of doom scrolling our way into sort of a negativity mindset.
Yeah. Really wanting to spend time here because I'm convinced that people are living with such degrees of stress that if I were to step into the body, a lot of men, especially that I work with, they might say that their stress is a 4 or 5 out of 10. But if I were to step into their body, it would probably feel like an 8 or 9 because of this adaptability.
Hmm.
So, recognizing the differences between the good stressors and the bad stressors, which from our conversation, it's this consistent, daily, persistent stress.
Yeah. I mean, financial hardship,
You got it.
overwork,
Yeah.
neglect, abuse, racism.
Yeah.
I also just think in this moment of political vitriol, whether you agree or disagree with any political platform is not the point. It's actually that it is designed for maximum
Yeah.
stress and, flooding the zone or whatever, which is the going line here from this particular administration.
Mhm.
Whatever, I get it as a political strategy. But where I'm coming from, I'm thinking of it more as like, what is this non consensual psychological
Yeah.
experiment
Mm.
on our citizenry? What are the impacts there? think we're all in a state, not all, but many of us are in a state of, constant amygdala hijack.
Absolutely.
And we just don't operate well in that state. I mean, we talked about some of the physical downstream impacts, but psychologically, that state basically bypasses our prefrontal neomammalian cortex, where we stop being able to make, rational, reasoned, compassionate decisions, and we become, a society of knee-jerk reactions.
That compassion is lost. And it's funny, we both talked about the sense of community for healing and connection to other people, but we've gotten to a point where we can't even ask questions
Hmm.
anymore, right? We can't share personal concerns just for the sake of conversation anymore. I have a hard time with it. You're certainly doing much better at it because you lead with compassion. That's the biggest difference. And we've lost that. And I think that people now, like the fear, the anger, the outrage, the upset feels really good because it's this perceived notion of action
Hmm.
when there's
Mm.
inaction.
Yeah, this was a uh, something that I was trying to untangle a little bit because, people often, there's a famous Martin Luther King quote that silence is complicity,
Mm.
right? And that gets levied at people quite a bit. So you're not speaking out on the Ukraine or on Palestine or on, immigration or what, and and so you're vilified for not speaking out.
Exactly.
But then at the same time, then when you do speak out, right? There's just as much invective there where, if people are part of your tribe, well, they're, heart, watermelon, whatever it is. And if you're not on your tribe, then it's, vitriolic barbs and ad hominems coming your way. And, one of my points I think I made it at some juncture along the path was that silence is actually the place in which we contemplate matters.
Mm.
We
Yeah.
actually study
Yes.
them and learn. It's also where we tend to find compassion and beneficence. And not everybody is an expert in every single topic under the sun. So not having an opinion on social media, does not mean that you're some sheep
Yeah. Yeah.
or that, you're some shill for pharma or whatever it happens to be. It's like perhaps you're just actually taking a moment in silence for some degree of psychological self preservation, but
Yeah.
also you might be actually learning or studying or contemplating or doing something that's not in the public spotlight that is helping bend the arc of the world. Maybe you're actually, you know, maybe you're volunteering at your
Yeah.
local soup kitchen, you
Yes.
know? So the
Absolutely.
amount of judgment that is levied as every single person seems to be a part of the public square now is tricky.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And even with the Maha movement, I've been a little bit quiet about it. I'm so grateful for the recent changes on red dyes and stuff like that. But let's pull back the curtain
Yeah.
on everything else that's happening also.
Yeah.
And the contemplation, it's actually a yogic practice called Mauna. Are you familiar with Mauna?
Mm, yeah.
Yeah, where you sit in contemplation. And I think that the benefit of that silence, which I've often taken, is it also lessens the grip of the intensity of reactionary,
Mm,
right? Of being reactive to everything that we're seeing and witnessing right now. And when that grip is loosened a little bit, all of a sudden it opens up perspective in order for you to kind of align with your views and everything that you just
yeah.
mentioned. Yeah.
Your pants are less tight.
Their pants are less tight. Yes. So thank
Well,
you for sharing that.
yeah, I think a lot of that space can actually ironically come from physiological practices as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, you know, like even a cold water,
Yeah.
therapy approach is like, what happens when you get into a body of cold water or into an ice bath? Well, you, you gasp and then you have that involuntary bottom up response,
Hmm.
which is a totally adaptive stress response, right? Your heart rate and respiratory rate increase. You feel that epinephrine coursing through your veins. You're going to have a panic attack. And then, no, you don't have the panic attack because right there you're offered a space to place conscious top down pressure, often through leveraging the breath, on top of that bottom up involuntary stress response. And that can become a invaluable skill not just in the ice bath, but more so when you get out of the ice bath, because that ability to actually find space and then put conscious top down pressure on top of bottom up
Yeah.
response
Yeah.
is so useful when you're in a political argument or
Mm.
when you're in a, you know, vitriolic, febrile discussion with your spouse.
Yeah.
So, or in traffic or at the dentist or wherever. So,
Yeah.
you know, these are why some of these practices are so important. It's not for what they provide within the practice themselves. It's what they provide outside of the practice.
You describe the dojo,
Mm,
emotional sovereignty. And it's kind of a training ground where we build this emotional sovereignty, which kind of ties into what we're talking about. What does emotional sovereignty mean to you?
mm,
And how would it help us navigate stress?
mm. That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I've never really thought about that term that way, but
Mm,
the way I would consider it would be the ability to always move back to some degree of psychological homeostasis,
mm,
to have that arrow in your quiver, um, such that within stressful situations, that you always have some ability to find centeredness and equilibrium and equipoise.
mm.
Um, and again, yes, that they're the more tried and true practices that we know about breath work and meditation that can help us do that. I also found that a fasting protocol can have unbelievable psychological benefits
Yeah.
as well as physical benefits, obviously. But, because you get hungry outside your fasting window, but what do? You don't just succumb and meander over to the larder for some chips. You actually have to witness the nature of that hunger and untangle whether that's a biological need or an emotional desire. And 99.99% of the time, it's not a biological need. We've got plenty
Yeah.
of
Indeed.
warehoused energy here to live for a while. You know, Generally it's an emotional desire. And I think that practice, helps you find that space between stimulus and response. This
Mm,
is the great Viktor Frankl concept, right? Between stimulus and response, there is a space, and that space is a choice, and in that choice lies our freedom and liberation.
mm.
So this is where, a practice that is ancient and spiritual in many respects, like fasting, actually can have a very, very potent psychological impact. Because if you can find that space between the stimulus, the hunger, and the response, the sort of mindlessly going to the refrigerator, can you not also find that space when, you might have that extra glass of wine, or you might need
Right.
to do that retail therapy on Amazon, or when your children are annoying, or your spouse says something dumb, or fill in the blank. And then, you're equipped with with that capacity.
Yeah.
And that gives you a degree of emotional sovereignty, that ability to always cultivate space to psychologically center.
So let's deep dive on some of those protocols then and what your protocol is
Mhm.
for good stress.
Yeah.
I love that a lot of them are founded in ancient wisdom, but let's start
Mhm.
off with fasting.
Yeah.
Fasting has been a hot topic. You call out some of, our great teachers and friends in your book. Fasting was an incremental piece to your recovery and switching around a lot of the biological markers that you found. So, first of all, was fasting easier for you because you had the biological evidence, running your labs, understanding your poop, your stool,
Yeah.
and all that stuff?
Yeah. I mean, I tend to be an empirical
Yeah, same.
fellow. So I like to understand mechanism,
Yeah.
because I think the more that you understand mechanism, the more likely you are to actually do the protocol.
And what a gift of modern medicine now, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that so much information is available. And then you can also tweak the protocol to best fit your bio individuality if you actually understand what's happening under the hood.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, yeah, devices and CGMs and things like that were pretty instrumental, because you can have some transparency, some, a dashboard, and what you can measure, you can improve, right? So I dug the empirical component of it, and that helped me along my way for sure. I would also say that and there's many, many different kinds of fasting protocols, from multi-day water fasts to OMAD,
Yeah.
one meal a day, and some people doing 5-2, or they're fasting twice a week, etc. And and I think that that's and the fasting mimicking diets, and I encourage people to experiment, with different protocols and find what's right for them. I mean, for me, I was never that into sort of a neurotic fundamentalist
Mm.
approach to
Mm.
fasting.
Yeah.
Though the 16A protocol, which is where I started and where I could find the most data, was really, really impactful for me. Mostly because when I was honest, I was actually had flipped it. I was eating 16 hours a day,
Right.
and I think that's where
Right.
most people honestly are.
Yeah.
At least
Absolutely.
in our society. If you go to any of these fast food chains, you'll find 4 meals a day,
Yeah.
breakfast all day.
Mm-hmm.
Great.
Yep.
Um, so just the consolidation of food into an 8-hour window, was a big switch for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I got hungry outside the window all the time. But of course, that armed me with that kind of psychological aspect that we talked about already. But yeah, I mean, the ability to burn fat instead of glucose for creation of energy, this idea of going into ketosis or getting into autophagy and cleaning up your dysfunctional proteins and
Mm-hmm.
upcycling your amino acids and whatnot. All of these become, for me, actually, the metabolic flexibility that was offered by fasting was really useful. This ability to sort of seamlessly switch between burning fat and glucose for energy production, um, that really upregulated my metabolism. So I think that, for women, I think there's different protocols. I think, you know, the conventional wisdom is that it's better administered during the follicular phase and moving into ovulation, and not so much in the luteal phase. And it's different for menopausal women. I think there are many, many women that speak incredibly eloquently about this.
Yeah.
My approach to fasting is slightly more broad in general, which is like, let's just stop stuffing our face all the time.
Exactly. Yeah. Notice how often you're snacking. And fasting, I'm so grateful, is one of those trends that has roots. I'll keep going back to
Yeah.
roots. It has longevity. And look at your ethnicity, look at your culture, look at your background to see how fasting protocols were used
Hmm.
instead of maybe diving in. I know a lot of
Yeah.
people will jump in and say, I'm going to do a 3-day water fast. And sure enough, they burn out and they never want to look at fasting ever again.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. The best protocol is the one you'll actually do. Right.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And I think this is the one of the other components of good stress is I would never advise anyone to jump into a 34-degree ice bath if they'd never gotten into a cold plunge. I would
Of
never
course.
advise anyone to run a marathon if they had never jogged before.
Mhm.
I'd never advise anyone to go on a 3-day water fast if they've never experimented with fasting before. I think the key here is that you just lean into the edge of your discomfort.
Mhm.
There's always the opportunity to increase duration or lower temperature or lower caloric intake or switch around your macronutrient mix. There's endless opportunity for that.
Yeah.
But just lean into the edge of your discomfort.
You share so beautifully about that in your book. What happens with your mindset during those times, right? And often that ends up being the greatest gift. Noticing how often you're in your mind, or your thoughts will really dictate your choices, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you feel hungry, you see food, you automatically eat based on instinct instead of as you've done. What you describe is just you stopped. Can you share a bit more about that? The beauty that you found in understanding your mind, the connection to your mind throughout the journey?
Yeah, I mean, every experience of reality is through the prism of your mind,
Mhm.
right? So to overlook the mind, um, is at your own peril.
Yeah, yeah.
So I think this is a place where we probably need to start, even prior to, all the more kind of bespoke practices and modalities and mushrooms and pills and praxis and
Mhm.
everything else. Um, and, one aspect that I found to be very interesting as I was getting to this work was that the happiest people seemed to be the people that were actually thinking about the thing that they were doing.
Mm.
So if you really examine what's happening in your mind across the course of the day, so much of the time you're sort of off somewhere else, not thinking about the thing that you're doing, or you're ruminating on some traumatic past event and then projecting that event into the future,
Yeah.
creating, I think this is a Daniel Kahneman term, but creating negative anticipated memories,
Mm.
right?
Yeah.
It hasn't even happened yet.
Yeah.
And,
You're living
and
it
it's
as though
already
it's real.
negative. You've already created a negative memory about something that hasn't even happened yet.
Yeah.
But when we're honest, we really take a inventory. We're doing that all the time. We're actually not anxious about the thing. We're anxious about the anxiety. And then
Mhm.
we become anxious about the anxiousness, about the anxiety. And we're
Yeah.
like masons building a brick house of anxiety.
Yeah.
We're just layering one brick on top of another. And, this is where, creative immersion or collective enterprise, um, and athletics and other things can really be very useful because it is in these activities that we actually yoke
Mm.
our thoughts with our actions.
Yeah. Yeah.
I watch my daughters dance. They're wonderful
Mm.
dancers. And this is what they're doing. They're not dancing to finish the dance or
Yeah.
to get anywhere on the floor. They're just dancing purely for the sake of dancing.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
when I'm kind of in my best mode, I'm writing purely for the sake of
Right.
writing. And we all have a sense for that where, linear time begins to dissipate and and we become totally immersed in what we're doing. This often happens in collective enterprise too, when we're part of a group doing something that could be just even at a dinner table having an animated conversation or in some sort of philanthropic endeavor. Certainly for me on the tennis court,
Mm.
every once in a
Mm.
while, every 1,000 days, I'll channel some Roger Federer and have absolute awareness of my body in space and time. Like I'll completely intuit where the opponent's going to hit the
That
ball
flow.
before they
Yeah.
even, that's right. It's flow state. It's something kind of beyond what we can truly understand, beyond what our, you know, the capability of what is normally available at the mind level.
Yeah.
We're just completely in, we're in and present and all here
Yeah.
and the more that we can find those moments, it appears the more happy we can be.
Well, you just painted a picture of the difference of living in a body that has a regulated nervous system.
Mm,
When you're in that flow state, when you're having those Federer moments, when you're seeing your daughters dance, they're in flow. Their body feels safe. They're in the present moment. There's no dysregulation. And then it's the, oh no, I've got to be busy. I've got to be worried about the future. I've got to live in anxiety. And then we get snapped out of it. Right.
yeah. Again, it's that tightness versus
Yeah.
that openness.
Mm.
Like we often can get that in nature too, right?
Yeah.
Where literally the aperture of our attention, quite literally, just goes super, super wide.
Yeah.
And that feeling of a separate self begins to dissipate,
Absolutely.
right? That you do actually become one with the external world.
Yeah.
You're walking through the woods and you're just super aware. You're listening to all of the sounds. You stop hearing it like a big monophonic wave, but you can actually place them on a stereo field where there's some birds over here and some rustling over there, and there's a squirrel up there. And it's almost like you're the engineer in this massive natural symphony.
Yeah.
Oh, you're just wide, wide open. What's the other characteristic of that? You really trust the world
Yeah.
and
Knowingness.
and you become less self-obsessed. In fact, you become there is no self.
Right.
And
Right.
this is why, you know, and, and this is the nervous system at play. And again, the nervous system, the sympathetic nervous system is adaptive in the right doses.
You got it.
But
Yeah.
but really where we want to be is in that open space.
Well, let's talk about then the benefit that you speak to of hormetic stressors.
Mhm.
Then, do you have a morning that you wake up and you're excited about the cold plunge? Have you gotten to that point yet?
Um, you know, it's funny. I always look at it with a degree of animosity.
Yeah.
You know, I look at it over there, It stares back at me and I say, "Oh, not today. I'm not gonna do it." The moment I say that is my cue to get in it.
Yeah.
It's pretty much like clockwork. Um, yeah, it's now become, a adaptive habit, and I don't love it. Who would love it?
Yeah.
And but it's part of who I've become. And it is really helpful for actually learning and doing things that require some degree of alertness.
Hmm.
And when you get out of the cold plunge, it's, equivalent to, uh, 8 shots of espresso,
Oh, yeah.
basically, right?
You're ready
So,
to go. Yeah.
but at the
Yeah.
same time, you're not jittery. That's the amazing thing about getting into the cold. You have that alertness without the cortisol,
Yeah.
without the jitteriness. And so it's really quite a wonderful way to move into what is sometimes known as an ultradian cycle, these 90-minute periods, which seems to be about the right amount of time for
Yeah.
optimal learning.
Mm.
So if you're having, to learning a new language or an instrument, even in later age, or jumping into a podcast or whatever, um, a cold water therapy protocol can help you be on your game.
Well, I think it's a commitment to a version of yourself. I think
Hmm.
you wrote about, one, your fasting protocol, two, the magic of your mornings and
Hmm.
the things that you did in the morning. But the combination of you using that as a protocol for Jeff
Hmm.
was actually a part of your transformation that
Hmm.
happened pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Can you share about that transformation?
Yeah. So, I was quite a bit heavier than I am now, and so weight management was a a big issue for me. And the stacking of various protocols together had an incredibly accelerated impact on my weight.
Hmm.
So, one was the intermittent fasting protocol of essentially consolidating my consumption of food into an 8-hour window. This was giving my body an ability to repair and restore. It was also giving my much maligned pancreas a
Yeah.
much needed
Right.
break from producing its insulin product. So that was a big deal. I mean, of course, you can still eat 10 pints of chubby hubby in an 8-hour window. But generally, when you're making some conscious decisions about your food consumption, you're making other conscious decisions. So for me, that was a more or less ketotarian approach
Mhm.
in the early days. It was, focused on, fiber and healthy fats and a couple
Bonus.
boluses, no, of protein, um, and minimal carbohydrates. So that ketotarian combination with intermittent fasting kept my glucose levels much, much lower. Then, before I would break fast, so before I would put a single bite of food in my mouth, I would get into the cold plunge. And if you think about then what's happening, so get in, your core body temperature plummets, right?
Mhm.
And then your body jumps into action because it wants to get your core body temperature back into that Goldilocks zone, the
Yeah.
warm porridge of 98.6. In order to do that, it needs to make heat. In order to make heat, it needs an energy substrate. But because I was on this keto diet and intermittent fasted, there was not a lot of glucose around. So it could only opt for one other substrate, and that was fat.
Fat. Mm.
And so it would essentially break down triglycerides, free up those free fatty acids and ketones for the production of heat energy to heat my body back up. And that was that little combination, that little Tetris
Mm.
was astounding to see the results. I lost 60 pounds in probably 3 or 4 months.
Cold water therapy, heat as well, in terms of our mitochondrial function. I think that the mitochondria, they need to have like just their own spotlight on stage
Hmm.
in terms of disease prevention, weight loss, proper mental function and performance. And um, it was probably such a big part for you. Like you're probably awakening mitochondria within your body that were dormant or,
Yeah. I had to kind of poke at
yeah,
them a
like,
little
hey,
bit.
wake up
I
a little
mean,
bit.
there's also, yeah, I mean, many of these practices actually activate mitobiogenesis, creation of new
Mhm.
mitochondria. There's also just what's happening at the subcellular mitochondrial level with, providing obviously the right macronutrient combination there, but also with infrared light. So this is fascinating as we, learn more about light therapy, the
Yeah,
impact
yeah.
of infrared and near infrared radiation at the mitochondrial level. So I started getting into that bit of it too. Um, and I mean, we can go into that if you want, but it's essentially it's this one little band of light on the electromagnetic wave spectrum, sort of outside of visible light, kind of at the end of the visible light spectrum, between kind of 700 and 1,000
Mm.
nanometers, more or less. And that kind of light is depicted in a very slow, long wave form versus like gamma and
Right.
X and UVB and UVA, which is like high frequencies, high amplitudes. This is like a kind of very like a nice calm C, which is why it penetrates the body so deeply. Similarly to like if you drive down Wilshire Boulevard here and you might come up to like an SUV, pumping hip hop on the street corner. The reason why you only hear the bass is the same reason. It's because
Nice.
those waveforms are like long and slow and stuff like that versus the high treble ones. And that's why it permeates and penetrates the steel and moves out into your car. These waveforms actually get all the way into the body, 8 centimeters deep, into the intracellular level, and stimulate the mitochondria at the that's CCO. What was that? I can't remember. Cytochrome oxidase, something right there, um, to essentially produce more antioxidant content.
There you
And
go.
so, more melatonin, intracellular melatonin as an antioxidant and glutathione. So you're to neuter the kind of free radicals and reactive oxygen species that are just a product of normal energy making. So getting that infrared light at the subcellular level can also really help mitochondrial function. So I
Yeah.
think there's all these that's a little bit newer and geekier. I think just getting really aligning yourself with the conditions in which we evolved,
Mhm.
that is the key.
Absolutely.
Just asking yourself this simple question: how did I evolve? And then making decisions about your life through that lens.
And what from, the protocol that you've talked about today could our listeners incorporate into their lives? Like if would you say for people who are listening who might feel overwhelmed, what's your entry point for
Mhm.
your readers?
Yeah. Be honest about where you are in your life and take so the honest inventory taking is really what has to happen first, the psychological bit, and then identify the areas in your life which bring you some degree of discomfort that you're always avoiding,
Yeah.
and then lean into them. And this might not even be in the physical or physiological realm. This might be in your psychosocial realm. I mean, for me, I spent decades upon decades avoiding
Oh, yeah.
conversations, for example.
Right.
Like conversations with people that I even loved because they were too stressful. But, if that seems to be part of one of your issues, then focus there. And, there are protocols for building, for example, your psychological immune system, the way
Mm,
we build our
yeah.
physiological immune system.
I love that.
So we build our physiological immune system through some low grade exposure to insult, to pathogens, bacteria, and viruses. And then we have this miraculous floating brain, this immune system that has an adaptive part of it that then spins up proteins that we call antibodies. And those antibodies will neuter those antigens on those viruses and bacteria, and they have memory. So if you confront them again, there's those recipes are preloaded. you build your psychological immune system in a very, very similar way by some low grade exposure to insult and challenge and obstacle. So if you actually lean into those things instead of avoiding them,
Yeah,
over time, those stressful conversations and those stressful situations, they just don't bother you as much. They're just
absolutely.
not as challenging. And you can lean in to the conversations that you tend to otherwise be avoiding.
I tend to, in the past 15 years of doing this work, I would say that the greatest healing that has come for people, and I can speak for myself also, the hardship of what a healing journey looks like in the beginning shifts into the greatest spiritual journey.
Mm,
And when your healing can become a spiritual journey, you are set for life.
mm.
You don't go back.
Yeah, I mean, if I don't think many people can find a time of growth in their life that wasn't preceded by
Yeah,
some form of challenge.
absolutely. Yeah. All right. We've had listeners this whole time. So we're going
Oh,
to get to some rapid fire questions
that's
very quickly.
that's fun.
So we put the question out to our communities, if they could understand better about their stress and their health, undoing the effects. So what's one takeaway for a woman in her 40s? This comes from Linda that she can start tomorrow.
Okay. Well, in your 40s, depending kind of where you are, you may be in perimenopause, you might be moving into menopause.
Yeah.
You're going to stop producing as much estradiol. This is just totally normal.
Yeah.
And by extension, you're probably going to start to develop some natural insulin resistance. And that's just kind of a metabolically, you're going to be running into some difficulties oftentimes, and sometimes that frustratingly looks like belly fat.
Yeah.
That can
Yeah.
look like low energy or brain fog, etc. So one of the things that I would say in for women in their 40s um, is to get into resistance training,
Absolutely. I'm with you on
and
that.
for many many reasons, but as a metabolic regulator, it is so potent.
Mm.
Muscle is a glucose vacuum.
Mm.
It is just a sink. It will just vacuum sugar out of your blood system. And also, when you're flexing your muscles and they're contracting, you don't even need insulin
Right.
to uptake glucose.
Mhm.
So and then of course, we're also losing a lot of muscle mass year over year as I'm
As we
54. So
age.
as we get older, we don't want to get into that sarcopenia and osteoporosis and stuff. So I would say get in the gym.
Get in the gym, get moving.
Yeah.
Nina is asking about the mind body connection. So, understanding, and I think you've done a beautiful job depicting this, stress isn't just about the brain, as we once thought. Stress is the instigator of the imbalances
Mm.
within the body. When someone's going through acute stress, then how can they come into the body?
Mm. Well, yeah, it is really interesting. I think by dint of everyday life, we're very, very used to experiencing something that our mind lays a negative salient surveillance on top of, like that's a threat or that's bad stress, and then we feel subsequently the impacts in the body. We're sort of
Mhm.
used to that directionality, but there's a bidirectional component of it, that stress and trauma is very much kind of anchored in the soma,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
And this is really interesting that we have a lot of adaptations for releasing stress that is kind of stuck, if you will, in the body. Crying is
oh,
actually
yeah.
an amazing
Release.
one. In
Yeah.
fact, if you were to take emotional tears and analyze them in the laboratory, you would find ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, in them. So when you're crying, you're literally flushing out
Right.
stress, literally.
Literally.
And
Yeah.
also, crying is often accompanied by like deep breaths. So we know that deep breaths, can help us also move into that parasympathetic state. And it's really interesting. I mean, other animals do cry, not many, but and I'll create some controversy here, but there's they don't really cry emotional tears in the same way that humans cry
Right.
emotional tears. They don't have stress hormones in the tears. Now, I know I've seen horses and pigs and cows cry and stuff like that too. So I don't
Yeah.
want to throw
Okay.
shade, but I'm just saying that crying is really quite amazing. Other animals run, like gazelles, for example, even after they
Mm,
escape
right.
predation, they will run 2, 3, 4 miles to metabolize that trauma out of them. So we know that when we feel stressful or there's sort of a trauma-induced response, that when we go and get vigorous exercise, we almost always feel better.
Absolutely. Always. We just have to get there.
Yeah, and there's a variety. I mean, we see dogs and possums shake, right? So you can do a little shaking if you want. Wolves actually howl as a
Mhm.
means of stress release, or if you
Right.
hear coyotes in your neighborhood howling, that is actually a way to reinstill social homeostasis. And primates groom each other.
Oh my
So you
gosh.
can groom your partner,
There
pick
you
the
go.
little nits off of him or her. That is also in a way to emotionally regulate.
I could talk to you for hours. I mean, I want to shout out your podcast, your incredible podcast. Can you tell our listeners where to find you?
Yeah, I do have a podcast, the Commune podcast. I think we're up to episode 650. Um, and yeah, I've written this book, Good Stress. So I've scooped up goodstress.com. So
Great.
so if you buy it there, I can throw in all sorts of goodies from all of our friends, Casey and Zach Bush and Mark Hyman, and great courses and whatnot. So
So many great
yeah,
courses, which I can speak to. Yeah, and if I show you the inside of my book, so this isn't just a book. This is honestly what I would say a protocol for how to meet life more fully. So I recommend that. And I wanted to touch on the science also because you have a very poetic, elegant way of making such a big topic very, very tangible. So thank you
good.
for that. You can see my highlighters, my folded
Yeah,
pages throughout the whole thing.
that's impressive.
And in closing, something that you've done that I do with a lot of my clients is you forecasted a vision of the future with your beautiful wife, Skylar.
Mm,
And I could feel so clearly when you were imagining the future with your glass of wine together and how you were going to feel. And
yeah.
I think it's so important for listeners to maybe pull back from the day to day and start thinking about the future. And despite the stress that we're going to experience in this life, what is capable, what is there for waiting for us as we age into this world of longevity and health span?
Yeah, well, many of us suffer from the ultimate stressor, right? Which is the fear of our ultimate demise.
Yeah.
Consciousness for humans has a double-edged sword, so we can experience subjective feelings and qualia, but we also know that we're going to die, and that mortality awareness creates a lot of anxiety for people. But I think there's a spiritual path to freedom from the fear of death.
Absolutely.
And not seeing our demise as this distension of morbidity, this kind of 20-year limp into decrepitude, but actually seeing the possibility to actually living a full, vital life. And the dream that I put forth kind of at the beginning of this book is that sometime, I think it's in the year 2088, my wife and I will be celebrating our
Mhm.
centennial, our 100th year anniversary. And it's not unfathomable. We've made it 37 years so far.
Absolutely.
And we'll go up to our little cabin and uncork a bottle of Chateau Margaux and curl up, and she'll read the same New Yorker article that she's read to me for about 50 years to put me
Yeah.
to sleep. And we'll drift off, and sometime in the middle of the night, my mitochondria and my cardiac cells and my
Yeah.
neurons and her mitochondria will put one last plume of carbon dioxide out its energy factory chimneys. And our sleep, will round a life,
Yeah.
and it's simply okay. It's just okay. And um and that we don't have to live with constant kind of fear of our ultimate demise. That, we're part of this kind of greater experiment, that in me truly is an atom that was shared with Lao Tzu and the Buddha, and and had its original provenance in some supernova some 8 billion years ago.
Yeah.
And, as, you know, my instruments of conscious attention come to a close and my cardiac and respiratory rate and function ceases, there's part of me that will go on, you know,
Absolutely.
and,
I
and
believe that.
so this is the vision that I'm trying to hold forth, for all of us as we move into wisdom and to become elders and not elderly.
Oh, yeah. Beautiful. Let's bring back our elders.
Yeah.
Thank you. Go grab your copy of Good Stress by Jeff Krasno. Thank you for joining me today. Until next time.
Yeah. Thank you so much.